We're going to now just move on to have presentations from 3 speakers who are working hard in different ways to try and build that evidence base. So our first speaker is Dr. Jan Mitchell, who is a research psychologist from Royal Holloway, part of the University of London. And Jan's been working with us over a number of years, and she did the evaluation of the first phase of our volunteer community eccentric viewing training programme. So Jan, I think you're going to talk about the results of that evaluation.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the contribution of my colleague Claire Bradley and also that of Amanda Reeves and her team at the Macular Disease Society. So this programme, devised by the Macular Disease Society, sought to take volunteers who had central vision loss and train them in the techniques of eccentric viewing, and then teach them how to pass those techniques onto other people who had vision impairment. So those trainers, the volunteers, went on a 3-day course that was run by a rehabilitation team where they learned about the sort of basics of eccentric viewing. They were taught how to find their own PRL and about eccentric viewing, to use their eccentric vision and to use steady eye strategy. They were taught about the effective use of lighting and LVAs, and then they were taught how to train others to locate their PRL and use these techniques. And for the trainees, they had 3 or sometimes more 1-hour sessions, one-to-one, with these trainers over a period of several weeks so that they could practice between sessions. So in evaluating these courses, we used the same evaluation system for both the trainers and the trainees, but we analysed their data separately. So about 2 weeks before the courses started, the participants had a telephone interview where we took demographic information, they completed the MACD qual and some visual function items. During the eccentric viewing training course, the trainers took the readings such as reading speed, visual acuity, reading distance. And then about 4 months on average after the training, there was a follow-up telephone interview which contained the same items as the baseline one, and in addition some questions relating to their people's experiences of the course. So looking at the characteristics then of the trainers and trainees, at the time we analysed the data, about 100 people had been trained, but we only had complete data for including the follow-up interview for 54 participants, so it's their data that I'll be talking about. And there were 44 women and 10 men with a mean age of 67 years. 28% almost were registered severely sight impaired, 20% sight impaired, and 50% were not registered. And they'd had MD on average for about 11 years. For the trainees, we had 98 participants with complete data out of a pool of some 200 who had been trained. They had a mean age of 80 years, so considerably older than the trainers. And registration status, 35, almost 36% were severely sight impaired, and they'd had MD on average for 17.5 years. So looking first at pre- and post-course reading speeds then, the trainers' average pre-course reading speed was 48.4 words a minute, and after the course it was 58.6 words a minute. That's an increase of just over 20%, a significant increase. And for trainees, their baseline or pre-course reading speed was 27.4 words a minute, and after the course the average was 34.7, an increase of, and a significant increase of 26.6%. We asked people in the post-course interview how useful they'd found the advice that was given on lighting and low vision aids. And this graph shows that the trainers, 38 of them said that the lighting advice was very useful. Only 3 said it wasn't useful. And 27 found the low vision advice very useful, and 5 said it wasn't useful. graph. Anyway, the proportions were very, very similar for the trainees. At the post-course interview, we asked people to rate the extent to which they agreed with 4 statements about reading following the course. Reading is easier, I can read for longer, I can read more types of written and printed material, and I rely on others to read for me less. And this was on a 5-point scale from disagree strongly to agree strongly. And we correlated the perceived usefulness of the advice on lighting and the advice on the use of LVAs with the extent with which people agreed with the statements. And advice on lighting and advice on use of LVAs was significantly positively associated with the agreement with the statement, I can read for longer. And advice on the use of LVAs was significantly positively associated with the agreement with the statement, I can read more types of written and printed material. These are small but significant correlations. For trainees, however, there were no significant correlations. So we asked people in the post-course interview whether they used the eccentric viewing and steady eye strategy techniques that they'd been taught. And about 3/5 of the trainers said they used eccentric viewing, and about 2/3 said they used steady eye strategy. For the trainees, the proportions were quite a lot higher. About 80% said that they were using eccentric viewing, and about 2/3 said that they used steady eye strategy. So we looked at the extent to which there was a difference in the amount of agreement about those statements according to whether people used eccentric viewing or not. And what we found for the trainers was that people agreed significantly that reading was easier if they had used eccentric viewing. And for the trainees, those that used eccentric viewing agreed significantly more that reading was easier, that they could read more different types of material, and that they relied on others less to help them with reading. When we looked at steady eye strategy, again, there was greater agreement that reading was easier for those that did use steady eye strategy amongst the trainers. And for the trainees, there was more agreement that reading was easier, that they could read for longer, and they relied on others less for the people that did use steady eye strategy. Now, we used the MacD-Qual measure of the impact of quality of life, the impact of macular degeneration on quality of life. And in this questionnaire, each item has 2 parts. And the first part examines the impact of an aspect of life on quality of life. This item I'm showing you is about family life. The first part says, if I did not have MD, my life would be anything very much better, showing a strong negative impact of MD on family life, through much better, a little better, the same, or worse, showing a positive impact of MD on family life. And they're scored from -3 through 0 to 1. And in the second half of the question, we ask how important that aspect of life is to someone's quality of life. My family life is anything from very important, scoring 3, through to not at all important, scoring 0. And we get a weighted impact score for that item by multiplying the impact score by the importance score to give a range from -9, which is a maximum negative impact of MD on this aspect of life, through to +3, a maximum positive impact. Some items have a not applicable option. This one, family life, does. So if people say they don't have a family life, they don't answer the question, move on to the next one. And we can get an average weighted impact score, a single score for all the items by summing the weighted impact score of all the items and dividing by the number of applicable items. So this slide shows the before and after MacD-Qual scores for the trainers before training and after training. And I've arranged these so in the order of negative impact. So the bars on the left show that independence had the greatest negative impact on quality of life. MD had the greatest negative impact on independence. And significant improvements on the impact on quality of life were found for independence, work, personal affairs, shopping, and friends and social life, that is following the course. And if you look at this first 10 or so items, which are the most negatively impacted by MD, you'll see that they all show some decrease in negative impact following the training, which is very encouraging. So that's the trainer scores, but when we look at the trainees, it's a very mixed picture, not nearly so consistent. And just 2 items, personal affairs and worries about the future, showed a significant decrease in impact following the training. So it's quite a different picture for the trainees and trainers. We asked before and after some vision function questions, how much difficulty people had performing a number of tasks. And unfortunately, we had a lot of trouble with our response options, and the participants found them very confusing, and we got some very mixed up data. So by the time we'd been able to sort it out and make the response options more easily understandable, amongst the trainees, we only had 9 people with completed data. So this graph just shows the results for those very few people, and it shows that there was a significant improvement, so less difficulty found reading text and books, reading mail, writing, finding out the time, and recognising faces following training. But unfortunately for the trainers in this case, we had no significant difference in a slightly larger sample. I think it was 12 people. Now, there are a lot of comments that were given from the trainees and trainers following their course about how they'd benefited from their reading benefited from the course and other activities. And unfortunately, I haven't really got time to show you them today, but they are on the handout if you'd like to read them. They're just a sample of the many comments that we had. So in summary then, the data show a mixed picture, with vision functions seeming to be improved more for trainees, but quality of life improved more for the trainers. And if you look at the handout, you'll see that there's some enthusiastic anecdotal evidence. And overall, the evidence is promising, and we look forward to looking at the results from the phase 2 of this eccentric viewing programme that's being organised by the Society. Thank you.
So I'm going to be talking about the EFFECT study, and the most important thing about any study is that it has to have a good acronym, and the acronym EFFECT stands for Eccentric Fixation from Enhanced Clinical Training, and we owe that to Michael Crossland, who came up with that idea. So, why do we need a study? At last count, there have been 45 studies of eccentric viewing training in the past 30 years. Eccentric viewing training is successfully used in Sweden, parts of Europe, United States, North America in general, and even in some countries in Africa and the Middle East. It seems that the UK is the exception. So why do we need another study? Well, the answer is that there are studies and there are studies. There are levels of evidence, and we've heard about that. And while all evidence contributes towards our understanding, there's a hierarchy with randomized controlled clinical trials at the top. And as far as RCTs are concerned, there's only been one that we were aware of when we did our review that has looked at eccentric viewing training. And that was done by the Nilssons in Sweden, involved about 40 people, half got eccentric viewing training and half did not. And they found very robust results. The people who got eccentric viewing training increased their average reading speed from 0 to 76 words per minute, while those who just got magnifiers increased it from an average of 0 to 23 words per minute. But there are certain quirks with the way the study was done, which I don't want to go into now, that led us to question whether this was the final statement, the final story. But whether or not we buy the results of that one randomized controlled trial, there are certainly questions about how we would optimize eccentric viewing training that haven't been answered. One question is who should receive it? Everyone who has macular degeneration with the central field loss, or only those who have unsteady fixation or some other characteristic? When should we give eccentric viewing training? Before the participants have had other low vision assessments and been prescribed magnifiers, early in the process, late, there are many options. And of course there are questions as to how we should do the eccentric viewing training. And perhaps the major focus of this question is whether we train the participant to use their self-chosen pseudofovea, preferred retinal locus, the area that they choose themselves to substitute for the fovea which is no longer functioning. We call that the PRL. The other option is to either help them or force them to use a locus that we determine is optimal. We've heard some reasons this morning as to why it might be optimal, because it allows a larger field of view or some other reason. And this is called a trained retinal locus, or TRL. So that's a major controversy. There's been one study that I'm aware of that's compared the two. It showed that you can shift people to a trained retinal locus of your choosing instead of the PRL of their choosing. You can switch them quite easily, but at least when you do that initially, their reading rate plummets. So you can do it, but it may not be advantageous. And of course, there's questions of how much eccentric viewing training is necessary. Systematic review was done in the United States, and they found out that anywhere from 20 minutes to 24 hours of eccentric viewing training was offered in various programs. And finally, how do you deliver the eccentric viewing training? Do you deliver it compressed into a short period of time or spread out over a long period of time? In order to evaluate these in the context of a randomized clinical trial would be all of these questions would be a massive undertaking, and we didn't propose to do that. But we did propose a study, which is funded by Fight for Sight, that will use some of the principles of how you design an RCT that we were discussing earlier. Carefully standardized measures, performance-based tests where people actually perform tasks, as well as so-called patient-related outcome measures, which is a fancy term for questionnaires. So we will include a wide variety of outcome measures. This is a 5-year program, and we're now into about the 3rd year. And I'm going to be giving you an update of where we are, but I will tell you now that there's no data to present, because it's the nature of these trials that you don't get to find out who's assigned to what group until you finish the study, so that you don't inject any of your own bias and fiddle the results. We designed this as a multi-arm randomized controlled trial. This was discussed a few minutes ago in the panel discussion. We actually have 4 groups of people. We have 2 control groups. One is just a group of patients who get regular low vision assessment and prescription of devices at Moorfields in an optometrist-led, primarily one-visit, non-multidisciplinary program. So that's the standard care that's offered to everyone. Then we have the standard care plus PRL training, preferred retinal locus. That's 2. standard care plus TRL, trained retinal locus, that's 3. And then we have an added control group. And that control group will come in for the same number of sessions and the same amount of social contact with the trainer, but won't receive any formal training in eccentric viewing techniques. He or she will simply do some reading of text in a semi-supervised manner and still have the tea and cakes that are offered to the other groups and the chance to have a chat and whatever other benefits may come from being in a clinical trial. A sample size calculation was done and was determined that we needed about 50 people in each group for 200 altogether. We decided on 3 training sessions because any more than that became unfeasible, and we've heard that 3 to 3.5 is about the average that the Train the Trainer program used. Our trainers are being trained by John Collins, and our primary outcome measures include just carefully standardized measure of reading speed, actually 2 of them, the MN Read test, which uses sentences in a descending series of type sizes, and the second is the IRES, the International Reading Speed Test, which is a group of short stories of about 150 to 200 words in 17 languages, so that you can make comparisons in multi-center studies, which isn't particularly relevant here, but they are all very carefully equated to one another. That's the objective measure. The subjective measures are the Masov Activity Inventory, where we ask people, how important is it for you to read medicine bottles? And if they answer that it's at least a little bit important, anything except no importance whatsoever, then we ask them, how difficult is it? If they say it's not important, then we don't find out how difficult it is. And the score is based on all of the ratings for the items that are at least somewhat important. That's the Masov Activity Inventory, or AI. And we're also using the MAC-DQAL, which you heard about just a few minutes ago. We're also doing a full health economic analysis. When I say full, I mean full according to the NICE guidelines. It only looks at the direct costs of the treatment and any additional usage or any additional usage of medical resources, such as showing up at A&E, having additional consultations with an optometrist or an ophthalmologist, or for that matter, a GP. And we are measuring, there's 2 halves to a health economic analysis, the cost and the benefit. And the recommended way to approach benefit is with a preference-based utility measure, and we're using several. None of them are satisfactory. There's the EQ5D, which asks 5 questions about how much pain you're in and how mobile you are. It's very insensitive to vision loss. And we're adding some that are slightly more sensitive as well. So we're ignoring some of the very important costs or cost savings, such as caregiver time and lost wages, things like that, because those aren't part of the NICE formulation of a health economic analysis in the UK. To be included in the study, and you have a handout that describes this, the person must have age-related macular degeneration. They must be a Moorfields patient or be willing to be registered as a Moorfields patient. They have to have vision worse than 6/12 in their better seeing eye, and at least a small or larger dense central scotoma in both eyes. They're excluded from the study at present if they've had any eccentric viewing training in the past, or if they've had a low vision assessment from a qualified low vision practitioner. in the past. We've been asked why we're excluding people who've had low vision assessment, and that's because we thought we could have the added benefit of seeing how much value there is just to the low vision assessment in the control group. But we may have to relax that exclusion criterion because we're having some difficulty finding as many patients as we hope who haven't already had a low vision evaluation. They're also excluded if they have any other eye problems, such as diabetic retinopathy, glaucoma, if they have severe mobility problems such that they can't come into the clinic for testing, and if they have very severe hearing loss and can't hear well enough to respond to the questionnaires. Our progress to date. I'm sorry to say that progress has been slower than we anticipated. I'm learning that that's almost always the case with randomized controlled trials. We're finding it somewhat difficult to recruit patients into the study, which came as a major surprise to us because Moorfields sees 450,000 patients a year. The low vision clinic sees between 4,000 and 5,000, of whom half supposedly have macular degeneration. So you wouldn't think it would be so difficult to find patients, but we are finding it somewhat difficult, so we're behind on recruitment. But we are putting in some special measures to try to correct that, and hopefully the next time I come back to speak to you, I will be able to report some results. To summarize, this study won't answer all of the questions. No one study ever can, but it should help contribute to the evidence base that we've been hearing so much about as to whether at least one form of eccentric viewing training is beneficial. In addition, we'll be providing a service for the patients. We'll be providing with the low vision assessment and eccentric viewing training. We hope that they appreciate that. And again, we hope to have the results. We have another 2 years of funding for the study, so I'm not sure when or if we'll be invited back, but if we are, we'll hope to have results then. If any of you have contacts or know of people who would qualify, they would have to live in the general London area. We pay for transportation, but there are limits, and who are either currently Moorfields patients or are not anyone's patients are willing to transfer and become Moorfields patients, then you could get in touch with us. Our name and phone number are on the sheets that are in your packet with a patient information booklet that the participant can read and decide if they're interested. So thank you.
I wanted to start with a bit of a proviso to say that we've only just started this study. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is really very preliminary stuff on what we're planning to do and why, really, and how we're planning to do it. But this comes in response to a call from the Macular Disease Society for someone or a group of people to carry out a systematic literature review, really looking at the effectiveness of eccentric viewing training and steady eye strategy. So I want to start to talk a little bit about systematic reviews and what they are and why we do them. So really, you can think of the general purpose of a systematic literature review compared to a standard literature review as being to try and take bias out of the equation. So bias can come from a lot of different sources in a literature review. I mean, first of all, from the studies that you're including. If you include studies that have been designed poorly, there will be bias within those studies that the systematic reviewer needs to point out. But perhaps a little bit more difficult to counter is the fact that reviewers ourselves are riddled with bias. Everyone has certain expectations or beliefs about how effective a certain treatment is, how effective a certain intervention is, and it's very hard to put that to one side. Even if it's completely subconscious, it's very hard to take that out of the review. Not to subconsciously
emphasise those studies that agree with your own viewpoint and sideline those that you don't necessarily want to look at. So the idea of a systematic review is that you set out very precise guidelines on how you're going to do the literature search, so that you're not allowed, you don't have the flexibility to bring your own bias into the equation. So we can minimise this bias by describing what we're going to do, eligibility criteria, how we're going to search for the studies we're going to include, and so on, before we actually start looking at the literature. We also search as many possible locations as we can so that we don't miss any studies. And I'll talk in a moment about how we're going to do that. And as I've mentioned, we also want to highlight if any of our included studies are poorly designed in any aspects, so that the reader of the review understands possible sources of bias, possible problems of the studies that we're including. So overall, the idea is that I'm not allowed to cherry pick the studies that agree with my preconceived ideas about how effective eccentric viewing training is. So thinking about the rationale for this review, this really marries in with a lot of the things we've been talking about this afternoon. Right at the start, Helen talked about the fact that there's 500,000 or so people with late AMD who only a small proportion of will be able to benefit from medical treatments. So there's a lot of people who need other rehabilitative strategies to help them utilise their remaining vision. And currently there's no comprehensive literature review that we're aware of all of the studies that have looked at the effectiveness of eccentric viewing and steady eye training. So the systematic review will help to, first of all, do what we've all been talking about this afternoon, build up this evidence base to tell us what's out there, what evidence currently exists about the effectiveness of eccentric viewing training. It's also going to tell us what evidence doesn't exist, which is also an important thing to know. But this is really pooling all of the information that we currently have, all of the evidence that we can currently take to healthcare providers about the effectiveness of eccentric viewing and steady eye training. And as we've said, with limited healthcare resources, this evidence is invaluable. We're also hoping that this literature review will help us to identify which types of training are the most effective, and also to show up gaps in the literature. So another outcome of this review may be to say, well, there's not enough evidence currently. We need to be looking at the effectiveness of this training, RCTs such as the one Gary's currently carrying out. So the overall objective was to really get a comprehensive overview of the literature that's out there at the moment, specifically to look at the effectiveness of the training, to summarise the models that are currently available, currently being used, and to identify gaps in the literature in order to put forward these new research questions we need to address. And just to mention our eligibility criteria, it's another important aspect of a systematic review that you say before you start how you're going to decide which studies go into the review and how you decide which ones don't. So the first one's fairly self-explanatory. The studies that we include in this review have to include eccentric viewing or steady eye training. We've also decided only to include those studies which actually have participants with visual impairment, so not the studies that have sighted volunteers with simulated visual impairment. The studies also have to include some kind of comparison. So it could be that you follow one group and look at before versus after the training, how their functions changed. Or it could be that you're comparing a control group who haven't had training with a group that have. But there's got to be some kind of comparison in the studies. And what we're actually doing in this systematic review maybe deviates a bit from the guidelines. There's a group called the Cochrane Collaboration that have written a very lengthy handbook on how to carry out a systematic literature review. And they recommend only including RCTs, randomised controlled trials. But as Gary's pointed out, if we were to do that, we'd be down to one study in our systematic literature review. So we've had to keep things a lot wider in this particular review. So we're including studies of any design, even those that may well contain sources of bias, but we're going to point this out in the review. We're going to put a table in there to highlight what the possible problems are with the specific studies. We're also going to look at all the references of the studies that we include to try and pick up other studies that may not have been flagged up. And we may also be contacting some of you with pleas for further studies that you're aware of that haven't been flagged up by our searching. So we'll be putting together a list and circulating that around to see whether people have other suggestions of studies that we should be including. And this whole process generates thousands upon thousands of potential papers that may be included in the study. So one of the large time-consuming parts of this is working your way through 5,000 possible articles to figure out which ones meet your eligibility criteria. And because it's very easy to glaze over after the 2000th study you've looked at, 2 people will be doing this independently to make sure that we don't miss anything. And in addition, to make sure we don't miss anything, we have to be very precise with the words that we put into the search engines to flag up these studies. So you can see we've got one column here, which is all kinds of words that relate to visual impairment and macular disease that different studies might have used. The other column contains all kinds of words that might relate to eccentric viewing training or steady eye training that studies might use. So for them to be flagged up by our search, they have to have one word in the first column, or at least one word in the first column, and one word in the second column. So just thinking a bit about some of the questions we're trying to answer. A lot of this is the same as the kind of questions that Gary's trying to answer with his randomised controlled trial, but we're looking at the literature to see what's out there at the moment. So first of all, looking to see how effective the training is at achieving different types of outcome. So we've spoken a lot about this afternoon, that different studies use very different outcome measures. And we want to look at whether there's evidence of this kind of training being more effective at delivering some outcomes than others. So for example, how effective is the training at improving people's accuracy of fixation and accuracy of eye movements? How effective is it at achieving clinical outcomes such as reading speed or visual acuity? And then on the more kind of patient report measures, how effective is this training at improving patients' ability to carry out activities of daily living or functional tasks at home? And this is where patients are given questionnaires or verbally taken through questionnaires before and after the training. And also quality of life outcomes. Is there evidence to suggest that this training can improve quality of life? And finally, coming back to the value for money, what's the economic evidence that's available at the moment? Second thing we need to think about is the kind of training. So looking at all the different models of training used in the different studies, is there evidence that some of them are more effective than others? And that might relate to the amount of training. If we look at the number of hours given by each of the studies included in our review, is there evidence that having more hours of training gives you better outcomes? Or whether the setting has an effect, whether it's at home or in a clinic or if it's in a group therapy setting, whether giving training materials and homework has an effect, whether it helps if this kind of training is integrated with other aspects of low vision training. And we're also going to look at whether the person providing the training is an important factor in terms of the outcomes of the studies. And finally, the goal of the training. This is something that we've spoken about again before, the idea that some models of training intend to give patients new trained retinal loci, whereas others are just looking at optimizing the preferred retinal locus that the patient selected. Is there evidence that one of these is more effective than the other? And finally, another aspect that's going to vary between the studies is the patients that they've recruited, the participants who are taking part. So the duration of visual impairment could well have an impact here. We're going to look to see whether the included studies indicate that getting people earlier on in the visual impairment, when the visual impairment has just developed, is more or less effective than providing that training at a later stage. Whether the extent of visual loss is important, and the age of the patients. So just to conclude, there's a real need for a systematic review in this area, partly to show us what evidence is currently available so that that database is consolidated, that it's a resource people can use to take to their local council, or that can be used on a more centralised basis to try and justify resources being channelled in this direction, but also to indicate limitations in the current literature to justify maybe funding of big randomised controlled trials to further develop the evidence base. And it's also going to help with training programmes and so on, if we can tell which model of training gives the best outcomes. So I'd like to thank the Macular Disease Society for supporting and carrying out this work, and thank you for listening.
I know it's been a long day, but I hope a very valuable and interesting one. I've certainly learnt an awful lot. And I hope that actually there's a few things that you might all each individually be able to take home and perhaps action or do differently or consider incorporating into some of your work. And I thought that it would probably be pertinent in the spirit of that commitment to action for me to set out a few things that I think the Macular Disease Society will commit to do as a result of today. And Cleon and I have compared notes, and so I hope I'm not landing you with too many things to do, Cleon, but they're both things that have struck us over the course of the day. So I think the first thing is that we've already committed to trying to build the evidence base around our own work and around the field in a wider sense, but we'll continue that commitment because I think it's really, really important. And as a result of today, I think we've heard quite a lot about the importance of trying to demonstrate the impact and outcomes of EV and steady eye techniques in practice, and including in that an economic analysis if possible. The second thing I think we'll do is that we will try and open and potentially lead a dialogue which is looking into supporting quality assurance of eccentric viewing and steady eye techniques. I don't know how difficult that will be, but I think we'll certainly try to open the dialogue. We're going to continue to build and maintain this register of EV and steady eye provision across the UK. We've got that built to a degree, but we want to continue to add to that. So I would really encourage you to get involved in helping us to build that, and we will maintain it and make sure that it's open to people. And so that will be useful not only in terms of the delivery pattern across the UK, but helping people to signpost and refer on. The fourth thing that I think we'll try and do is that we'll continue to work with a range of professionals and professional bodies to improve understanding and awareness of eccentric viewing. And I think that's really important, not only from the perspective of eye health professionals, but for patients, for learners, and actually for funders, commissioners and managers. So we'll continue to try and build awareness. And then finally, we're going to try and continue to create this network and build this network of professionals. So we want to make sure that you've got access to information, to resources, to materials, to the latest research reports, and also so that you can try and share best practice. So we'll try perhaps in another couple of years to bring you together to put on another conference like this.